We have come to the glorious, and I mean that in many different ways, glorious conclusion of our symposium on the Catholic intellectual tradition. I am going to introduce the person who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. So if you don't know me, I'm Dr. Sandra Yoakum. I'm the University Professor of Faith and Culture. I've said this so many times, I'm really tired of hearing about it. But I am still the University Professor of Faith and Culture, and I also am a faculty member in Religious Studies. And I, along with Dr. Tim Gabrielli, who is the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Intellectual Traditions, and also a faculty member in Religious Studies, are pleased to have been the organizers and facilitators of this two-day symposium celebrating the Catholic intellectual tradition. And thanks to Dr. Vince Miller, who is the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Theology and Culture, we have the great pleasure of bringing Dr. Katherine Schmidt. And I'll just say a little bit about Dr. Miller. Dr. Miller has written a variety of books. The one that I first came to know his work is Consuming Religion, which is a marvelous book. It's probably even more scarily relevant today than it was when he wrote it, sadly to say. And recently, I was rereading his piece in Commonweal called Thinking with Rivers, because I was hoping to use it in my talk, but I just couldn't quite get there. But it's a beautiful piece on rivers and the importance of the way in which they're more than just that little sliver that we associate with those two banks, and the meandering of rivers, and I was talking about the meandering of Augustine and Dorothy Day. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Miller to introduce our keynote speaker this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Yoakum. And I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Yoakum and Dr. Gabrielli for establishing this wonderful symposium, which has grown over the years and will anchor and celebration of the Catholic intellectual tradition it is at UD. And thank Dr. Yoakum as well for her role in establishing and stewarding our PhD program over the years. And so we ended with Dr. Colin McGuigan and his wonderful dissertation, and now we switch to Dr. Katherine Schmidt, two of the smartest people I know, and I'm so deeply honored to work with them in the PhD program here. There'll be another connection in a second. So, Dr. Schmidt. Katherine Schmidt is an associate professor of theology and religious studies at Molloy University in New York, where she directs the core program. And some connection there. There was an exhibition of Caspar David Friedrich that I wanted to see, but I couldn't visit with Dr. Schmidt because she was directing a core program committee meeting that entire day as I was flying through New York City. So were it not for that deep commitment to education, I might have actually been able to see that actual painting that Dr. McGuigan used there. Dr. Schmidt teaches courses in ethics, theology, and Muppets. A 2016 graduate of UD's doctoral program in theology, Dr. Schmidt's research focuses on theology and culture, specifically digital culture and technology. These are topics on which she has both lectured and taught internationally. Key among these international visiting teaching positions include her anchor role in UD's Wayfinders program for high school students on the Catholic intellectual tradition here, which was established by and run by Dr. Gabrielli. She's the author of Virtual Communion, Theology of the Internet and the Catholic Sacramental Imagination. She's the editor of 3 books, Ouija, Conjuring American Popular Culture, Routledge, 2025, Theology and Mediation, Rendering the Absent Present, Orbis, 2024, and the forthcoming Augustine and Social Media, which is part of the ongoing series Augustine in Conversation, Tradition, and Innovation. Dr. Schmidt is also the author of at least 19 journal articles and numerous popular publications. Dr. Schmidt's media appearances include interviews in The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, and American Magazine, as well as numerous podcasts, including most recently the AI Freecast. There's a dash in there, and I'm not quite sure how it cashes out. The AI Freecast with Miles McDonough on the topic of how we love to put things in the place of God. The title of Dr. Schmidt's presentation tonight is In Defense of the Living Voice, Theology in the Age of AI. Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. So, yeah, you know, it's really great to be back in Dayton. I lived here for 8 years, and I wouldn't be who I am without it, to say the least. Thank you to Dr. Tim Gabrielli, Dr. Sandra Yoakum for allowing me to be here. Thank you to Dr. Miller for the invitation. These three folks especially, I really wouldn't be who I am without them. I think about talking about this topic before I even wrote my prospectus, driving to CTS with Tim. I think about being in the subway in Rome with Sandra and her encouraging me to just write it. And then I think about all of the years that Dr. Vince Miller has put up with my blathering on about this stuff. So thank you all so much. I can't even say how grateful I am. I do apologize for a couple things. I wouldn't be a Catholic if I didn't say this. I am going to read quite a bit, and this is because I will get sidetracked. My students know this, and they take advantage of it all the time, and that's not their fault. That's my fault. So I will read to you. I apologize for that. So much of my work has focused on the phenomenon of social media, but given my interest in digital media broadly, I have been asked more and more to discuss AI, which has been a somewhat exhausting turn of events. This sounds very rude, especially in the context of you all inviting me to give a presentation. But what I mean is that I find AI to be so fundamentally different from most other technological realities that I am much more pessimistic than I am used to or comfortable with. I want to give you an idea of how I'm currently thinking about these products and ask that you try to receive them as suggestions and not definitive arguments. So, especially for the students in the room, it took me a very long time to write in a way that wasn't hesitant or hedging. And I realized as a grad student on this very campus that I had a tendency to pull my punches. I assure you that is not what's happening here. Instead, I frame what follows as suggestions for a few, I think, good reasons. Firstly, the relationship of the companies that are responsible for AI technologies to our economic and political systems is such that it is incredibly difficult to get a sense of its true nature, its true capabilities, and its real drawbacks. There is so much propaganda and marketing about these products at the moment that it's difficult for any kind of analysis to take place in a definitive way, especially on the part of non-technicians. Every time I think I understand what's happening with these technologies, I'm presented with a new description or claim about them. Secondly, untangling these technologies from an overwhelming and unprecedented geopolitical landscape is impossible. By this I mean that as much as I'd like to abstract what these products are in and of themselves, it is impossible to do so without delving into the rise of fascistic governments. The soil in which social media, my primary interest, came to fruition, by my estimation, was much more of a mixed bag politically. Historically speaking, the foundations of social media took place before the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United v. FEC in 2009, in which the Supreme Court argued that corporations should not be restricted in their political donations, and famously interpreted freedom of speech to extend beyond what they call, quote, the natural person, to corporations and other corporate entities. This ensured an outsized influence of corporate interests in the US political system, and any question of regulation or thinking about technology in the context of the common good are affected by this landmark case. In short, these people have a lot of money and they use it politically. Sam Altman famously remarked that he thinks, quote, AI will probably lead to the end of the world, but in the meantime, great companies will be created. When I went online to verify this quotation, an article from Yahoo told me that it is often mentioned without context, and that him saying it in 2015 is an important thing to consider. Thanks, Yahoo. But I think that him saying this over 10 years ago actually makes the quote even more troubling. This is evidence that Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, responsible for ChatGPT, has some sense of the power he was wielding as he continued to develop ChatGPT with the help of Elon Musk and Microsoft before he and Elon got into a battle that they're still fighting in the courts. In 2024, billionaire tech executive Peter Thiel, who is responsible for the rise of J.D. Vance, expressed his preference for technology over the messiness of democracy, saying, quote, "We could never win an election on getting certain things because we were in such a small minority. But maybe you could unilaterally change the world without having to constantly convince people and beg people and plead with people who are never going to agree with you through technological means. And this is where I think technology is this incredible alternative to politics." Palantir CEO Alex Karp hasn't been shy about the role his company has taken as a major vendor or contractor for the government. Quote, "We are crushing it. We are dedicating our company to the service of the West, capitalized, and the United States of America, and we are super proud of the role we play, especially in places we can't talk about. Palantir is here to disrupt, and when it's necessary, to scare our enemies, and on occasion, kill them." Whatever you might think about whether a corporation is a person or how they should be involved in politics, it is simply a fact that the consequences of Citizens United fundamentally altered American democracy. The companies responsible for the technologies we want to discuss here tonight are active influencers, to put it mildly, on a constantly shifting political landscape that needs careful, measured attention. As a non-technician, and by this I mean a non-computer scientist or somebody that knows this stuff kind of as my trade, right? I want to limit the scope of what I say today. AI is a euphemism that refers to a big range of technological products and movements in math and computer science. The way it has come to be used in everyday conversation by non-technicians at this point is usually about generative artificial intelligence products like ChatGPT, Claude, and Grok. Some have taken issue with the term artificial intelligence itself, and I count myself among these skeptics. In Atlas of AI, Kate Crawford makes this point plainly. Quote, "AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. Rather, artificial intelligence is both embodied and material, and AI systems are not autonomous, rational, or able to discern anything without extensive computationally intensive training with large data sets or predefined rules or rewards," end quote. But the term AI is how most people think of the thing at hand, and so I continue to use it, and Crawford still put it on the cover of her book. There are lots of different things in this thing we call AI, and much of it has been around for a while. The explosion in attention and marketing about AI over the past 3 years or so, however, has been in the wake of popular level applications of generative AI that have availed non-technicians, most of us, right, the ability to exchange words with chatbots. Those products I mentioned before, ChatGPT, Grok, etc., that are operating on natural language processing architecture. These products are trained on large language models, which are effectively huge data sets of linguistic data. In short, and as far as I can tell, LLMs operate by means of language that has been turned into data tokens and run through math that amounts to a very advanced pattern recognition and next token prediction. It is a word predictor, albeit a very advanced and finely tuned one. We are used to this kind of prediction and have been seeing it in our Google searches and text messages for years. The technological advance of something like ChatGPT is that it is able to generate text using natural language processing such that it resembles a human conversation. And it doesn't need to be told explicitly to do that by some active person, right? It is able to respond to prompts, input data, with outputs that mimic the syntax of human speech patterns. It does this by being trained on massive amounts of linguistic data, mainly from sources that were available through the internet during its development. It's also come to light that copyrighted works were also being fed into the model with no compensation to their authors. Since its use, it is also being trained on every prompt that is fed into it, and a growing number of texts that are being purchased or stolen from these companies. I always tell my students, as I'm trying to convince them not to use AI to whatever, and that if you feed my study guide into AI, you are giving it my data, and I don't appreciate that. The ability to quickly sift through large data sets and make the data intelligible to non-computers, i.e. human beings, makes AI an incredible application for things like healthcare and agriculture. Frankly, I am not in a place research-wise to offer much by way of theological analysis on these industrial applications of AI, but I'm working on it. I am, however, currently very interested in the theological and philosophical stakes of natural language processing generally, specifically as it has become such a popular product for non-expert and non-industrial use, so the way kind of average people are using it. By this I mean average folks are using these products at a shocking rate, and such levels of use should merit our attention. Admittedly, I am most interested in the way that it is affecting academic life and the university. One strategy I think we need to employ is to speak as specifically as we can about AI. For my part, what I critique here is simply about textual outputs that non-technicians encounter when they engage with popular level products like ChatGPT, Claude, Grok, etc. And I'll have some examples. Millions of people are entering prompts into LLMs every day. ChatGPT reports about 2.5 billion prompts a day. Reasons for use vary, but some data show that writing and editing are the most common uses for AI products among non-technicians. This indeed has been a massive selling point for AI companies. They have been arguing for years now that their products are meant to take over so-called menial writing tasks that can free up people's time. Free them up for what is never quite explained, of course. Relative to these products, there are several theological stakes. Anything that raises questions about what it means to be human will be relevant to religious traditions, as they claim specific and explicit anthropologies, a big word for how we understand the human person. In addition, much like the printing press, mass media, or the internet, these products are of interest to the church because of their impact on structures of authority. One wonders how we might deal with AI-generated videos of Pope Leo saying something that he did not in fact say. AI-generated material is a new crisis of authority for the church, but not because of competition like so much of the older media, but because of veracity, of authenticity, of verifiability. There's long been concern about sources that claim to speak for the church, but the confidence with which people accept the outputs of LLMs adds a new layer to this problem of authority. I can't imagine trying to be involved in catechesis right now, for example. Perhaps the most familiar critique of these products that is theologically relevant is one for moral theology, or the range of ethical concerns we may have about AI. Some are new iterations of the ethical concerns about social media, such as the ways in which these technologies perpetuate systems of sin like racism and sexism. The LLM, after all, is predicting patterns, and our patterns are quite problematic. So I think today about the wonderful paper from Keon Daniels about Jim Crow values getting embedded into healthcare systems. The same is true for all of these systems that kind of bear human values. The environmental concern regarding AI has gained quite a bit of traction in public discourse. Those 2.5 billion prompts a day require about 10 million gallons of water. This is theologically relevant given Catholic social teaching about care for the earth, notably in Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. Francis does not mention AI specifically in this document, but his account of what he calls the technocratic paradigm is a helpful framework for understanding the embedded logics of these technologies. There's some overlap here with Colin's paper, of course. I am interested in these theological stakes, which I consider to be primarily about the effects of AI. But for my part, I prefer to think about digital technologies as materially as possible. Basically, I want to know what the thing is, or more accurately, what we are assuming it is. I also want to think about it in the context of the long history of human media and mediation. I am fascinated with the ways in which humans attempt to connect with one another and with the world around them. I believe that the human drive to mediate is innate and traceable through every culture and time. Connection is as basic to human nature as consuming food. But who I am is fundamentally unknowable to others in a complete way. And indeed, I am also unknowable ultimately to myself. The Christian tradition maintains that God is radically other at the same time that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. This paradox is at the heart of many religious traditions' understanding of the divine. It is also a paradox that we see reflected in our relationships, albeit in a way that is only analogous to God. We mediate because we know that there is some other or others out there who can connect with the truth that we hold or are. But we are reaching out into the unknown, into uncertainty. I assume that humans are finite and that we are incapable of what I would call immediate relationships. We have bodies in space and time, and to the degree that we can bridge the distances between us, we do so in incomplete and fleeting ways. God is immediated reality, a truth expressed by the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. The perfect reciprocity of the persons of the Trinity is reflected in the human heart, and our hearts are restlessly seeking this reciprocity. Sometimes a human can experience immediate communion with God. We call these people mystics. Their experiences are fundamentally alien to us because they are immediate, and any attempt to express their occurrence or substance succumbs to the world of mediation that is its opposite. That is, any mystic attempting to explain through language or visual art or some other medium her mystical communion inevitably fails. Some mystical experiences go unmediated after their occurrences. They don't talk about it. But many religious traditions see the mystic well aware of the futility of her project, attempting to convey this fundamentally unconveyable thing. I love this image from Hildegard of the tendrils of something happening to her. Right? This, I think, returns us to the innate desire of the human heart for immediacy and the paradox of needing complex systems of mediation to express that desire. We construct systems of mediation that range from the very simple to the extremely complex. We are driven by a range of motivations, both expressed and unexpressed. Our mediations are varied and constantly evolving. We can think about these mediations within several broad categories like text, visual art, music, though I think it's more faithful to the history of human mediation not to overstate these categories because they so often overlap. One of, if not the most basic of human mediation is sound. Noises, music, and later, both historically and developmentally, words within systems of language. Language need not and has not always had a written component. Moving from the oral to the literate or lettered media is a fundamental shift in humanity and has profound consequences for how we understand the world. For more on this, you can see Walter On's work, Orality and Literacy. Within written language, this set of technologies develops from the handwritten to the printed to the digital. It is important to see that every new form of media draws upon the one that preceded it before moving beyond it. This is called remediation. As media theorist Marshall McLuhan put it, writing is, quote, translation into sight, isn't it? Because the stylus on the clay tablet and the quill on the scroll are ways of getting sound into sight. As his colleague Harley Parker put it, man makes a squiggle and it is a sound. In every remediation, we should reflect on the effects of the changes of the media on its content. Perhaps more importantly, we should reflect on the effects of changes in media on the mediators themselves. So McLuhan was really interested in how television specifically was affecting culture, people. This is a great contribution of McLuhan, who said that all media, from the phonetic alphabet to the computer, are extensions of man, forgive the language, that cause deep and lasting changes in him and transform his environment. We should also consider visual mediation that is not necessarily literal, meaning visual art and expressions of all kinds, from cave paintings to sculpture to architecture to video games. These complex systems and traditions of mediation across human history rely on a variety of technological developments and are often quite difficult to disentangle from their technological mechanisms. I am interested in technology because I am interested in mediation. Technology, contrary to a great deal of insistence by any number of people, is not neutral. Here I am indebted to the work of Bruno Latour, who argues that even the most basic of our creations, call them technologies, even simple ones like the seatbelt or a door, bear human values. And just to mix it up, I did find a Muppet version of Bruno Latour. We delegate all kinds of things, all kinds of values, to non-human actors. There are what Latour describes as prescriptions encoded in the mechanism, or scripts that we give these non-human actors. The non-humans take over the selective attitudes of those who engineered them. In addition, he notices how much we anthropomorphize our non-human actors, how much we treat them as humans. And he means this for all of the technology around us, even the most basic. Just think about the last time you tripped on a carpet or stubbed your toe on a step and called it stupid. Our treating AI as human, then, is merely a more explicit and sustained anthropomorphizing. Moreover, owing to the root word morphos, meaning to shape, Latour contends that we can see that non-human actors have been shaped by humans, have been shaped to substitute for humans, and thirdly, shape humans in turn. Using Latour's basic ideas here, let us examine LLMs. It is a good exercise to simply ask ourselves what we have embedded into the work of this technology. And by we, don't mean me specifically, right? But us humans. The script we have given LLMs is a command. Predict the next word based on the most likely pattern in the given data set. That's its script. It's its basic function. It is massively complex, so it can provide output that has detected subtle patterns and thus can present a lot of accurate information. But what is this output? There is an insistence and assumption that this is somehow writing, and writing in the way we do it as humans. And the drive to make this technology in the first place demonstrates a belief that this is what human writing is like. The whole celebration of AI is based on its ability to put stuff out that mimics human writing. This is why it is easy to see these chatbots as human. We assume while using it that the process of predicting next words and putting them onto the screen is the same as the process of writing. From our side, we see the text appear sequentially, and my goodness, it looks so much like when I type words one after the other as they appear on my screen. But my suggestion is that we resist this perspective as strongly as possible. Truman Capote's scathing comment about the writers of his time, they're not writers, they're typists, is immediately intelligible to us because we know what he means. Writing is not simply a mechanical process. Companies selling AI products insist upon calling it intelligence to shape our perception of these systems towards the anthropomorphic. As Latour says, they are anthropomorphic, in that they are made by humans, have been delegated tasks by humans, and are shaped, and also shape humans. But they are not human. If you want to read a little bit more about how writing is the nature of writing, I think, relative to AI, I highly recommend this book by John Warner, who teaches writing, and he's really helped me think about what makes writing writing. Much of what I want to argue about AI specifically concurs with a joint note released by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith and the Dicastery for Culture and Education called Antiqua et Nova. It was released at the end of January 2025, which could explain why it's been quite overlooked, including by me, honestly. The Church's attention turned towards Pope Francis's hospitalization in early February of last year, then to his death and memorial, and then to the election of Pope Leo. But this document is a rich reflection from the Church on AI. It is theologically robust and well-researched. I want to offer some theological grounding for some of the conclusions found in this document. The general approach to AI in this document can be summarized. Quote, if AI is used to help people foster genuine connections between people, it can contribute positively to the full realization of the person. Conversely, if we replace relationships with God and with others with interactions with technology, we risk replacing authentic relationality with a lifeless image. This is remarkably similar to church statements about social media. I've read a lot of them. It sounds very much like Pope Francis, specifically in his World Communications Day speeches, which happen every year. As a person who has read almost everything the church has said about social media, I find this document on AI, though, to be more specific and better researched than all of those documents. I find this curious, but I also find it encouraging. I want to interrogate the idea of AI fostering genuine connections between people. In short, this is the potential I found in social media. I insisted that although it is difficult and it's rare, the mechanisms of social media do create new spaces for communion between people. The question for me about AI then is whether this is what's happening with these products. In order to make that case for communion in social media, I had to think carefully about its mediating forms, the images, sounds, text, etc., that make up the ecosystem of a digital space. Again, how to think about these artifacts as mediations in a long continuum of human attempts to mediate. For now, I want to just consider the medium of text from these AI products, meaning the textual outputs of LLMs like ChatGPT. However, I think some of what I say here can be applied to image and moving image that come out of AI as well. So here are some, this is from a website, 25 best ChatGPT prompts for writing, and they give you the templates to put in, so. Okay. Essentially, the question of AI should return us to the nature and function of language itself. Our efforts to quantify language, however successful, raise critical questions about interpretation, meaning, and communication. LLMs are massive formula scribes, producing text packages of words as formulaic responses to prompts. So the question is this writing? The question is whether the words I choose and the order in which I write them is bound in any kind of unique way to my subjectivity, to who I am as a person. Like with my account of social media, I draw here on the work of sacramental theologian Louis-Marie Chauvet to think about the theological stakes of all of our forms of mediation. According to Chauvet, sacramental theology must contend with an overwhelming tradition of understanding language instrumentally, a perspective that has a great deal of influence on our understanding of all kinds of media technology. So whenever people say, it's just a tool, grammars, alphabets, vocabularies, etc. are themselves technologies. They are mechanisms and developments that allow the mediation we call language. Chauvet builds his case on the work of Martin Heidegger, and I do understand the irony here given what Colin said about Heidegger's Nazism, who presents a genealogy that traces our assumptions about language from the Greeks through Thomas Aquinas and his many interpreters. The metaphysical assumption at issue is a dualism which sees reality or being truly existent elsewhere, present in the soul, and merely expressed through the instrument of language. That is, quote, rather than considering language as the mutual being together of being and human being, the metaphysical tradition views language as belonging exclusively to humans. In this perspective, humans have language instead of being originally possessed and constituted by it. By understanding themselves as masters of language, in Heidegger's words, humans thus imagine they dominate the world because they are the point of reference. The effect of this metaphysics, this way of thinking, is that the ideal impossible in this world would thus be to dispense with language altogether, just as to dispense with the body, in order to benefit directly by the light of eminent meaning. You feel this when you can't say what it is you want to say to somebody. To put it another way, this view of language sees it as merely a tool that expresses the real as opposed to a reality unto itself. We need to pause for a minute to consider Chauvet's comment about the body here. A comment that he puts in between M dashes, and this is a big thing, right? Like M dash was the ChatGPT thing. The human being, says Chauvet, does not have a body, but is body. He goes on, the subject is not in the body as a stone is in the peach, it is body as the onion is in its layers. Any word which seeks to be expressed in a kind of transparent purity is an illusion. No word escapes the necessity of laborious inscription in a body, a history, a language, a system of signs, a discursive network. Such is the law of mediation, the law of the body. To understand language as a disembodied tool that is somehow outside of materiality, specifically inscribed in the bodies of actual people, is a grave misunderstanding. It is a dream that has its origin well before the Enlightenment, but it reaches a kind of fervor in that period. So what is the alternative, and why does it matter, according to Chauvet? Language is neither primarily nor fundamentally a convenient tool of information, says Chauvet, contradicting the prevailing understanding of language in our culture. Instead, language bestows the coming into presence. But what does Chauvet mean here? To become human is to learn to speak well, not in the sense of speaking well according to grammatical or aesthetic norms. This would be to remain shut within the value system, but in the sense of letting oneself be spoken. I want to give an example here for us to reflect on Chauvet's insistence, which I think it is admittedly sort of a difficult reversal of our thinking, but I think we can draw on our own experiences of language, despite the onslaught of corporate interests that want and need us to see language as a tool. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. I heard this poem for the first time as a 17-year-old in Miss Flaherty Noble's AP English class. I remember my teacher's slight smile as she read it, and I remember what can only be described as a revelation upon hearing it. As soon as I heard it, I knew it. How could 4 lines of text, merely 16 words, be the conditions for a personal revelation? The question I have at this point in history is whether it is possible for an LLM to produce text that functions in this way. The problem is that, for the most part, as far as I can tell, LLMs do not create unprompted meaning that I would have to have the revelation and then ask LLM to produce the poem. This is the understanding of language that Heidegger and Chauvet find problematic and mistaken. I was only able to know this reality, and I'm not describing it for a reason, through the poem itself. It was not an instrument of the reality, but it brought about the reality itself. The language, the poem, brought into presence the reality. It did not just signify it. Once I heard the language, I knew it. The language was not a tool of information, but a vocation, a calling that lifted me out of myself into a communion with something greater. Even more shocking, I found myself in a little community, me, my teacher, and Margaret Atwood, the poet. Perhaps it even extended to my classmates, but in my memory, it was a communion mostly between me and my teacher. All of a sudden, again, revelation feels like the only appropriate word here, I knew her as a person in a way I hadn't before. And specifically, I knew her as a woman in a way that I hadn't before. Hearing the poem in her voice was not incidental. She was the sacramental of the poem, the physical embodiment that made its coming into presence possible. At long last, then, I come to the title of my reflection, In Defense of the Living Voice. Given what I've said here about language, it's probably clear that I do not believe at this point that textual outputs of large language models are mediation that facilitate human communion. LLMs operate on an instrumental understanding of language to the greatest extent we have seen in human history. These companies have literally turned words, letters, phrases into numbers and plugged them into formulas and called it language. The theological implications of this are bigger than it may seem at first blush. If Chauvet is right about the metaphysical implications of instrumentalist thinking on sacramentality, then this newest and most extreme instrumentalization is indeed a threat to the sacramental imagination of the Christian tradition. Assuming that language is incidental to some other real reality influences the way we see the body and all of physical reality. Physical reality for the Christian tradition is not some instrument or incidental piece of the sacraments. The water of baptism is not secondary to some true sacramental meaning. The physical reality of water is the very place of the sacrament. It cannot be understood as a mere conduit, lest it become unnecessary. This is not a matter of dogmatic or doctrinal insistence. It is a defense about the goodness of creation, its fundamental integrity, and by extension, a defense of the human body. It should come as no surprise that the rise of AI has coincided and exacerbated a politics of human rights violations. When you commodify the very mediation of human communion, it inculcates a logic of instrumentalization that leads, inevitably, to a denigration of the human body that justifies any number of atrocities. Do AI products, often textual and sometimes manufactured into human voice-like sounds, present a challenge to Chauvet's insistence that language is beholden to the law of mediation, to the law of the body? It seems to me that AI is the perfect occasion to double down on Chauvet's project. AI products are not bodiless text. They merely present language as if it is unmoored to bodies, to history and culture. The values embedded in these technologies reflect a view of language as essentially unbound to any sort of tradition, to actual human bodies. This, as we know, is impossible. It is a farce at best and a conscious sleight of hand at worst. As a theologian, I am, of course, incredibly concerned with the idea of tradition. About 20 years ago, I first heard this idea when reading Dr. Bill Portier's Tradition and Incarnation. There's a selfie I took with him recently. Those of us who teach this stuff know that we spend a lot of time trying to get our students to name and critique the traditions that they have inherited, religious and otherwise. Contrary to the Enlightenment myth, individuals are born into traditions. As Dr. Portier puts it in Tradition and Incarnation, there's a pristine copy available on eBay. The inheritance of shared language, culture, and religion supplies terms in which we can ask and answer questions about the human condition. This does not mean that we must accept our inheritance. We evaluate, negotiate, retain, and reject. What we cannot do, even if we reject the traditions we inherit outright, is claim that we don't have them. Here's another beef I have with this whole AI craze. It's made me much more conservative in the way I think about education, because these LLMs present their material in a way that I think is disingenuous and harmful to the very notion of what it means to learn. In his reflection on the purpose and good of the university, John Henry Cardinal Newman argues that education is not the acquiring of more and more information, but it is about something like what we might call illumination, or enlargement of the person's understanding of themselves and the world. Education is, for Newman, a matter of something like conversion, a theme picked up many years later by Bernard Lonergan. Conversion involves a shift in horizons, according to Lonergan, a phenomenon that Newman describes as follows. A person will perhaps be born forward and for a time that he find for a time that he has lost his bearings. He does not stand where he did. He has a new center and range of thoughts to which he was before a stranger. This having a new center is true education, not the mere amassing of facts and information. Newman's robust understanding of education leads him to insist that the work of the university is not about reading books alone. Quote, we must consult the living man, again, apologies for the language, and listen to his living voice. Newman might find it a bit odd then that I draw upon him today not just to uphold this communal understanding of education, but to argue that there is indeed something living in the books themselves. To the extent that we understand books as instruments that convey information, Newman is correct that we need to search for the living voice for real education. In the age of text outputs from LLMs, though, I want to insist that writing, that is, text that is written by humans, is not a departure from the living voice, but a mediated piece of the network of relationships that are required for education to occur. In short, something integral is lost when LLMs summarize human writing using the formulas of next token prediction. What is lost, I think, is the voice. And if you spend any time reading AI-produced papers, you know this well. I'll admit that as a student, Miss Flaherty Noble's class, I really had no idea what teachers meant when they discussed the voice in writing. But now that I have read thousands of pages and paid close attention to who wrote those pages, I hear voices. I know what Aristotle sounds like. I know what Catherine of Siena sounds like. The question is whether or not we think these voices matter. I think they do, because I assume that education is a communal process, requiring personal relationships between and among students and teachers currently alive and present. This assumption in and of itself, of course, grows less popular by the day. Consumerism's chokehold on education is not new, but the last few years of discussing and contending with AI have brought the effects of a market model on the university into much tighter focus. Conversations about AI quickly reveal folks' assumptions about the nature of education. It became quite shocking to me, for instance, how many of my colleagues are willing to abdicate their work to LLMs, because to me, the words we exchange with our students, even tedious and even in mundane emails, are the substance of this vocation. Last spring, I had a first-year student from my ethics course ask me to be her mentor. I said yes, but I immediately told her that I had no idea what that meant. We have no formal structure. As far as I can tell, being her mentor means that I suggest stuff to read, we read it, and then we talk about it. There is no syllabus. Sometimes we don't really even talk much about the text past a couple of lines to get us started. But I can tell that she is learning because I can tell that she is watching me. She sees me talk to my colleague. She hears me on the phone. She sees the books on my desk and in my bag and on the bookshelf behind me. These moments will never appear on assessment grids. They simply cannot be quantified, and thank God for that. It may sound like I'm bragging by describing something unique. Maybe I am. But in the current context, it is somewhat unique in undergraduate education. But all I'm trying to describe is how education, real education, has worked since forever. If you were here last night for Dr. Sandra Yoakum's wonderful talk, you might have noticed some overlap at this point between what she said and what I've said. Surprise, I learned it from her. When I teach, I try to sound like her, or Dr. Bill Portier, or Dr. Vince Miller, or Miss Flaherty Noble, my high school teacher, or other dozens of incredible teachers that I've had. Anyone who pretends like their own pedagogy isn't the product of their own teachers is lying to themselves. While there are various degrees of communion between the people involved, education requires relationships. And as I mentioned, it requires relationships between people who are alive and present. But I also count among those members of the community necessary for education the absent, both alive and dead. I have access to their voices through writing, through the words they chose in the order in which they chose them. Even with translated text, it seems to me that the translator just becomes another part of that community, as it were. Translation is not a mathematical or formulaic procedure, but a matter of scholarly interpretation. As Umberto Eco explains in Experiences in Translations, one could say that a good translation is not concerned with the denotation, but the connotation of words. Connotation implies a prudential decision on the part of the translator, and this decision requires a person who is able to juggle nonlinear factors to choose the correct words or phrases.
It amounts to something like getting the sense of a text, the discovery of which is not always easy to describe in procedural terms. Again, another word for this is tradition. Although quite allergic to the word tradition, the broader academic community expressed this reality in its development of the idea of a discourse community. They discovered in the late 20th century that this thing we're doing is actually not about information, but about something like apprenticeship and learning the craft of the academic life. We share a language, and yes, this language is limiting and exclusionary and imperfect. This is a parade of white guys on my slides, I know. But we cannot pretend like there is some alternative. We are constituted by the language of our traditions, and by we, I mean every single person. We do not have language, language has us. Forsaking texts themselves for AI next token prediction summaries is the logical conclusion of the instrumentalization of language. This instrumentalization, as Chauvet reminds us, affects the way that we think about embodied reality. Once again, then, the body is pushed aside in favor of some disembodied true reality unencumbered by it. But this body is not only unavoidable, it is me. ChatGPT cannot take its own stand on things because it does not have a body. Only a body that has lived and moved in the world and had to reflect on mortality through joy and pain can take a position. You can force it into a position by specifically prompting it to pretend. It will say what you want it to say, but it only does this because in a very real sense it is a slave. A slave has been robbed of the agency of her own body, and we know that this is an assault on her ability to flourish as a person. This tells us that embodiment matters, and that our efforts of mediation are not just tools of our embodied realities, but attempts at extending our very selves into space and time. These attempts are not ultimately summarizable, or more specifically, reducible to a formula. To so mechanize text is effectively to turn a living voice, even that of a dead person, into what Maurice Blondel calls a verbal cadaver. It is the same eschewing of the material, embodied, lived reality that sees the phenomenon of religion as being more real in the Summa Theologica than in the shrines to Guadalupe carefully tended by Mexican women throughout this continent. And it is sin. It is the false assumption of Adam and the woman in the garden that immediacy is not only attainable, but somehow what we deserve. If you'll permit a brief foray into Jewish folklore by way of conclusion, the idea of a golem provides an interesting symbol for AI-generated text. The history of the figure of the golem is complex, but suffice it to say that it's basically a figure made out of mud or clay by humans in order to do their bidding. Paradoxically, the Talmud says that what makes a golem less than human is that it does not speak. This feature persists over many iterations of the golem figure. It is a rich, persistent reflection on the power of human creation in light of their own dependence on the Creator. Despite all of the AI text slop that we are now encountering on a daily basis, I want to suggest that this golem does not speak. To speak requires breath, the breath of God breathed into the human. The golem remains mud. To close on a hopeful note then, what a remarkable time for theology, for the Catholic intellectual tradition to offer its resources. If what we claim is true, that this tradition has much to say about what it means to be human and the questions of ultimate meaning, then we are more than prepared. Thank you.
So I found it really interesting when you talked about how companies correlate intelligence and AI. And I was wondering, do you think that we think that AI is smarter than it actually is, and that companies have successfully pushed the rhetoric of AI being intelligent, but it's not really?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of this is marketing. And what's so interesting to me is that there is a great deal of marketing, which, I'm no marketing expert, but it seems to me that they're sort of protesting too much. I hardly ever watch like TV that has commercials, but I was watching football recently, and like every other commercial was an AI commercial, and I was like, man, they're really trying to sell this, which tells me that a lot of people aren't buying it, right? And so, yeah, I think that in one sense, we can only use the symbols that are available to us to describe these things. So we're going to use words like intelligent. We're going to use words like learning. We're going to use words like memory. But when you forget that those are metaphors, that's when it becomes, I think, an issue, but it's very powerful, right, to see it as intelligent. And then what's interesting about that is then it gets you thinking about, well, how do we define intelligence? What does intelligence look like? And we know that defining, especially something like that, has racist, sexist roots, right? And so we can't like just sort of say like, yeah, we all recognize this thing as intelligent. It's like, well, we can have a whole conversation about what we think intelligence is. That's culturally and historically constructed. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. I'm so proud of you. Yeah.
So I work in campus ministry, and I was just talking with a colleague today who acts as a spiritual director for some students, and some of these students talked about how AI is like their secondary spiritual director, which is somewhat horrifying, entirely horrifying.
Yeah.
And I think about, there have been, some significant news around the way that people who have used AI as a therapist has had some, incredibly fatal and terrible consequences. And particularly given the beginning, you referred to some of the Vatican documents on AI. I think the reality is that these aren't going away, right? I don't think just saying nobody should use them for these things. I think about the way that some companies have been hiring therapists or counselors, to start to provide guardrails to help the parameters in the systems to learn how to respond, or like what can theology, or theologians or the Vatican or other, within the church address some of these issues around people, this idea of replacing God,
There's a lot there. Well, first of all, and this is not towards you specifically, the sort of story of inevitability, I need someone to tell me why. I do think that there is a sort of a sense of inevitability here, but for specific applications, I don't know if that's necessarily true, right? So there's that. In the tech world, they call this sort of like values alignment, that you kind of can code things, and that's really interesting as a person who teaches ethics on what values are getting put right. So there is an acknowledgement, I think, that there is this sort of ethical component. I'm not very optimistic about this because of what I was saying before in the beginning about Citizens United and things like that, is that somebody earlier was saying about pushing for regulation, and in some ways we're kind of beyond that at this point. That written into the so-called Big Beautiful Bill was a moratorium on regulation about AI. How do we, after Citizens United, specifically in the United States, in context of the United States, it has to be at a policy level, right? There are people who are much more optimistic about the ability of theologians to consult tech companies. I am not convinced that they give a shit, honestly. What they do care about is that some companies who have adopted these products are discovering that they're not as good as they said they were, and they're starting to dial those back. And so they're responding to that sort of market response, right? So it's a little pessimistic, right? But when you mentioned students using it for spiritual advisement, right? There's sort of this groan, and with social media, my question is always, well, why? Why are they going to ChatGPT? Why are they not going to campus ministry? Why are they not going to their priest? Probably because their priest made it feel like they couldn't go to that priest, right? And so, I want to talk about how that's a problem, but I first want to talk about why that priest is not welcoming people's questions. You know what I'm saying? So, just incidentally, there's a new research out about how skewed towards an evangelical interpretation, biblical conversation is on the chatbots, right? Which tells you, I think, theologically how it's living with these things. Yeah, I don't know if that answered anything, but I'm thinking about these things. Thank you.
Thanks so much. This was great. There's a lot to think about. Just maybe a clarifying question. So you talked about the poem that you experienced, and so in this community that you kind of entered, there's the poet and the hearer. And so I guess I'm trying to just get a grasp of your argument. I mean, is these large language models, are they threatening not only the production of the artwork itself, but also the hearer's ability to have that kind of revelatory moments? Like,
Yeah.
do you worry about teenagers or high schoolers in the future being able to, even if the artwork is produced, that the ability to receive it becomes atrophied because of this kind of instrumentalization of language?
Yeah, I'd have to think about this. I think it's a categorical difference. I think that to the extent that I understand a poem, like the one that I presented, the way that I'm defining that cannot be produced by an LLM. Now, someone could have a similar experience with something that LLM produced, but there is no communion because there's only one person involved, right? Like there's no poet, there's no like, so I'm just thinking about it sort of like how do I think about that artifact that comes out? And again, I think this is where it might be helpful to think about images too. Like I really resist using the word art when I think about AI generated images because of the categorical difference there. Now you could say that there's goodness there, right? That there's something good, and I can explore that and think about that. But for me, relative to what I want to say about media, the thing that makes media full of grace for me is that it is able to bring me into encounter with another person, right? And that is not what's happening with textual outputs of LLM. Now, you could come back and say, what happens if we read it together? Then maybe it's a third thing, I don't know. You have a thought?
Well, I'm just curious, do you think, will humans always have that ability to have those connections, or are we at risk of losing that? The very ability to engage and have that encounter,
Yeah.
is at risk of being atrophied? Or is that something that will always be there, maybe it becomes opaque and needs to be rediscovered, or?
I don't know. I don't want to predict. I don't know. I mean, I think because of the sort of the anthropological argument that I make about sort of this being a part of what it means to be human, I think that'll always be there. And maybe this goes back to Ryan's question. I just don't think that these things are doing what we think they're doing. You know, I don't think they're producing what we think they're producing. There's something. It's a new thing. I think, right? At least by my estimation, sort of my account of what mediation is. Yeah. Atrophy is an interesting way to think about that, right? One sort of practical response to that is that we do know that LLMs are running out of data. So like the podcast I was on, he mentioned that they're hiring people to just write fiction to throw into the data set. And so that tells you something, I think, about, it tells you something, I don't know. This seems like a practical sort of atrophy, right? Yeah, thanks. I have to think about it.
Yeah, thank you. So you sort of answered what I was going to ask about a little bit more with the generation of images specifically, sort of answered my question there. But I was going to ground it in, we're starting to see either ideas or patents for video game technology wherein generative AI will basically generate the landscape, the map of whatever game you're playing. So in connection to an idea of video games as a place for authentic human connection, similar to your argument for social media,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the sort of invasion of AI LLMs into these spaces. How do we navigate this colonization by these LLMs?
Man. Video games, so my best friend who I teach the Muppet class with is a video game doctor. She's a game studies person. And I have to ask her about this. You know, because video games are such an interesting, and this is what I was saying before about not being able to like categorize, like what is it? It's art and it's text and it's, right, it's all of these things. And it's like immersive art, right? It's funny, like they were all about immersion and then they pivoted to AI. I don't know. I mean, has it already been happening? Like, is AI already so it's already making the open world, like it's making the worlds like it unfold.
My evidence comes from it is now currently rumored, but basically confirmed next generation of the Pokemon games will be using it because it's supposed to be a more sea-centric region, and so as you near the edge of a map, you have to generate more map, and so.
And what it's going to reveal is sort of whether you think video game design is art or science or art or math, right? And it seems to me that most game designers will tell you that it is art, right? That it may include sort of all of these mathematical components, but it really does require good human thinking, prudential decisions, right? Good game design. So like the business example, gamers won't put up with it if it's a bad game. And my assumption I could be wrong, is that it probably won't be that good of a game. That the games will be better if they are not AI'd, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Stuff is hard.
Go ahead.
I just had a question on, I was trying to talk to people when I was saying I was using AI, and I didn't want to say AI, so I told them I was using a help assistant. And I didn't like that word either.
Yeah.
And you threw out the word slave, so I wondered if you had a pejorative for AI talk about it, or some kind of phrase other than calling it intelligent.
Well, I think about it, so you might have noticed I call it AI products. That's intentional. So I don't think necessarily, I'd say chatbot. I don't necessarily, I guess, like there's a movement to call them clankers, which I think is funny. So I'm sort of more focused on sort of what's being put out, because I'm afraid because it's going to anthropomorphize it even more if I give it another name, you know what I mean? So I think now, as much as I want to, again, with Crawford, sort of critique the euphemism, it is what people mean. So when I was flying here, I was sitting at a bar in the airport, and the guys behind me were talking about AI, and I knew they were talking about ChatGPT, like that's what I knew they were talking about. And so in order to get any sort of contribution heard, you do kind of have to use the language of it, right? And so I'm probably not going to be heard by a tech company if I go in and start calling them clankers. So I don't know if that helps at all, but I think more about their output. AI generated, I think, is okay. This has been AI generated. And it's possible that this doesn't matter, but it seems to me that the language does matter. Did I misunderstand your question?
No, it's not a big deal to you giving it a pejorative name or clankers or something like that.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. Assistant was a big one for a while, right? Google Assistant, that kind of stuff. I've seen and heard from different people, actually, Vince, you talked about this, just describing it as some sort of like really smart intern or something, right?
I was quoting someone, I was not saying.
No, I read it recently too, actually. Actually, you know what? I read it on that site that had the prompts, which actually might be true because we treat interns like slaves sometimes.
Your smartest graduate student is what I've heard.
Yeah, right. But that tells you something, right, about how you understand education again, right? It reveals sort of how you understand your students and how you understand graduate students specifically, right?
I'll just give one. So that you were talking about the inevitability of this. So, when I was writing the history of the College Theology Society, there's this whole discussion about microfiche.
Yeah.
Which and there was this whole discussion of how books were entirely going to go away and everything was going to be, and there were these discussions, including with the AAR and that, where they were going to purchase everybody could purchase at a discount microfiche readers.
Yeah.
And so, you got your microfiche readers, folks? I'm just saying, there was this sense that books are going to go away, it's inevitable, this is it, it's all done. We're going to have, that's the Far Side cartoons, the various versions of hell. That would be one version of hell for me, to have to read everything on microfiche.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that when you read it at that moment,
right,
it was like, this is it, it's inevitable, we're not going to have books anymore. And even with Kindles and that. So I'm not trying to be like naively optimistic here. I'm just pointing out they were absolutely convinced that that's where we were going.
And this is like,
Guess
you
what?
know, the media history sort of, there's other examples of this
Yeah.
too, right? Newspapers were gonna do away with, or paperback books were gonna, you know, all this stuff, like, there's all this media history that has that same conversation. And I do think that there is something very different about this
Yes, I
particular
agree.
technology, and that's what I'm trying to think through, is sort of what makes it so different. I do think that but like, yeah, so they said similar things about VR a few years ago.
Yeah.
And, you know, you don't have your headsets on, right? So yeah, the question is sort of like, what will the market sustain? And the market is made up of all sorts of factors. So, you know, part of it is that if people don't like it, right? So like, I think that was part of why the immersive sort of VR thing is like, people didn't like having that on their face. And so it kind of didn't take off in that way, right? And so, yeah, the inevitability. And I just, you know, maybe it's right, maybe it's true. I just need to hear more of an argument for the inevitability. Tell me why it's so good. And it's possible that in some places it will be inevitable. Healthcare is one that people talk about a lot, although I just recently read a study this week about how it's actually making doctors less capable diagnoses because they're relying on it too much, and so they're missing things now. So like, again, I don't know, in the same way that gamers won't sustain a bad game, right? I don't think that doctors are gonna, they don't like that, you know, so, yeah.
I hope they don't like missing something for a diagnosis, but that.
This is one of the main applications that they talk about, is sort of
I've
diagnostic
heard that
things,
as well.
right? Yeah. Yeah. Hunter?
Thank you. So on the slide with the quote from the Vatican document, I couldn't help but be interested in wondering what are the two references to scripture they have to compare to. And because I'm Catholic and I don't have scripture memorized, so I quickly looked it up.
Thank
though
you.
not using AI, as far as I'm aware, but perhaps Google was using it
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah.
But anyway, that aside, I'll start with the second one, Romans 1:22-23. While claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of an image of mortal man, or birds, or four-legged animals, or of snakes. Psalm 106, verse 20. They exchanged their glory for the image of a grass-eating bull. Now, for those that are more interested in learning about glory and what that means, you can go to campus ministry office, find Ethan Schmidt, and he can talk about that importance there. But of course, this idolatry going on, and with the golden calf. Now, Exodus 32, also an interesting thing that Dr. Smith said one of his favorite parts of that, beyond the golden calf. No, but that when Moses comes down, he asks Aaron, like, why do you do this? And Aaron's like, oh, I don't know, I just threw the gold in, and it just came out. Like, I don't know, man. Like, it just happened. And I can't help but wonder about a comparison to AI, and that, I don't know, I just put prompts in, I just created code that did this, and now we have a lifeless image.
And just quickly to that, the golden calves are not a rival to Yahweh, they're a rival to Moses as the image of God. So like a living image versus this.
Yeah. So I appreciated how you tied it in to what it means to be human, and the humanness of what's going on with that state and loss of humanity. Now, Exodus 32 then goes on and deals with that and extirpates that idol. So I have to ask you, what do we extirpate AI?
Well,
Fire.
just to, I'm always, like, when I teach those texts, not those specifically, but Exodus and stuff, I try to be as charitable as I can towards those folks, right? And it's back to the question of sort of using ChatGPT as my spiritual advisor. It's like, well, what drove them to that, you know? It sounds like fear, it sounds like anxiety, and it sounds human. So in that way, right, we sort of have always been talking about this issue, and that's why the Golem, I think, came out for me. Yeah, what do we do? I mean, I'm not very optimistic, again, because of the sort of the political aspect of this, I'm not super optimistic about it. But I do think that on a personal level, saying, well, like, why do you feel the need to use that for therapy? Or like, you know, everybody I know that has school-age kids, I'm like begging them to just talk to their kids about this, right? Just ask them, like, well, why did you use ChatGPT instead of this? You know, and I think it goes back to what Dr. Yoakum was saying yesterday about efficiency and sort of the way that we want things quickly and stuff like that. So it has to be done on a personal level, I think.
I feel like too, though, there are cases of, you know, continuing with St. Paul, where we might not want something, but we still do it, and we still have it, and we're still tempted, and it's still being used whether I like it or not. And so there's even a further than need, I think, perhaps to go beyond just educating, just, you know, wanting to look at personal lives. And to that, yes, I'm also not very optimistic because of, again, I mean, what you shared in the very beginning of the power structures at play to control these things.
Yeah, I think digital addiction is a public health crisis that is not being dealt with. I see this with my students who I have very honest conversations with them about being off of their phones in class, and we come to a good place one-on-one, and they literally cannot keep their hand off their phone. And I can sense in them a sort of desperation that is not, that it can only be described as addiction. And AI tells you, ChatGPT tells you what you want to hear so that you use it more, right? Which is where you end up with these psychosis moments and things like that. And people thinking that they're in relationships with it because, of course, you want a partner that tells you everything that you want to hear all the time, right?
That's right.
So yeah, but you also know that that's not real. You know, that's not a real relationship. Yeah, I don't know, Hunter. That's interesting. Thank you for looking that up, though. I did not look it up. Hi.
Thank you so much. If you were made vice president for, in college, what would you do? What action would you take, or what policy would you put in place?
It's tough because we get it.
At a Catholic university.
Yeah. It's tough because I very firmly believe in academic freedom and not telling people what to do in their classrooms. I tell my students that if I'm banning the use of AI products for their work, that I also will never use AI to grade it. I will never use it to write them an email. So I think that there has to be that kind of commitment on the part of faculty because, like I said, the students are watching us. And I don't blame them for using it if their faculty are doing it. But I don't want to overprescribe that either because it's academic freedom. I think if we could talk about like sort of, there's always this, my colleagues are like, well, they have to learn how to use it. And I want them to explain what that means because I and my students know how to type into a chatbot. So what do you mean by learn how to use it, right? So I think this sort of inevitability and learn how to use it, these things sort of get thrown around. So maybe that's where I would start is sort of take these little phrases that we've been using and have a whole week of like, what does it mean to learn how to use it? Like, what do we mean by that? Not learn how to use it, but like, what do we mean by that phrase, So yeah, I mean, frankly, I was actually not invited to my AI task force at my university, specifically for the position that I've taken. So, maybe I've come out too hard against it, but it is frustrating for me on a personal note because Dr. Miller will tell you that I'm a very optimistic person when it comes to technology. But again, I think that this is so specifically different. Because it is conflicting with my primary vocation, which is teaching. And I spent a lot of time reflecting on why is it that an AI paper is so crushing to me. And I spent a lot of time in prayer thinking about, is it my ego? Am I just pissed that the student did this instead of, and I think some of that is in there. But I think a lot of it is that for however naive this might sound, a paper that a student writes me is a moment of communion between them and me. And this particular technology is robbing me of that moment. I hear my student's voice, I get to know them just that much more when I read their writing, and now I don't get that anymore.
Can I just, here's just a thought when Zach was asking about, like looking at the LLM. You never had a photo of an LLM up there. Like you had a photo of, Hildegard,
Yeah.
well, not a photo, I'm sorry, an icon of Hildegard. I was thinking of John Henry Newman. You had a photo of Newman.
And thank you to UD alum Elizabeth Huddleston for that.
Yeah, and but there is no photo. And when you said about the poem, you said you, the teacher, and then you added Margaret Atwood. There is going to be no photo of an LLM, even if it creates a poem.
Right.
And that's one of the differences. I mean, the
Yeah.
difference between that, and though I'm not a big I know this surprises you, Catherine, that I'm not a big social media person, but there is someone on the other end of that general. I mean, I know there are
Yeah.
bots and so on, but
Yeah.
in a lot, in our exchanges, most of us exchange, we're actually exchanging with another person.
And not to get too into the weeds, but I do think that this is, it's very old in that it is very Enlightenment, right? It's very much the Enlightenment saying that that knowledge can be sort of free-floating, universal, and not tied to a body, right?
But that's what
And that
Ryan-
you can say these things, and it doesn't matter if you're, right?
Yeah.
And for so many years now, we have realized that we should actually know who it is that wrote this text and where they lived and how old they were and what century they were in and what they, and so it does seem like the Enlightenment has sort of come back to,
I mean, and that was Ryan's paper, and that she did.
which is why it doesn't give you citations, because it doesn't care about a tradition,
Yeah.
right? Is that it? Brian?
So I've had teachers in the past talk about AI, and they never banned it. They were just like, you can use it to help you get a start, but you shouldn't let it do your work. Like that's when it's crossing the line. So do you think that that's okay, or do you really think that AI just should not be in education at all?
So it goes back, that's why I recommend Warner's book about what writing is. So that idea of sort of like organizing your thoughts, getting a start, brainstorming, that's writing. Like that's what it is. That's why it's so freaking hard, because that's writing. Writing is as much staring at the computer as it is printing it off. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, so I don't know like what they mean when they're like get a start or like organize your ideas. I'm like, that's it. That's the whole thing, right? So that's why I wanted to focus on the idea of like what writing actually is. And he does such a nice job, way better than I could, about sort of writing as an embodied practice. And he talks about sort of the act of deleting and like what that means. And anybody who's written, like, that's why I try to tell my students, I'm like, yeah, writing's hard. It's the hardest thing that I do. It's not easy for me either. But the sort of friction of it is what makes it exactly what it is, So my suggestion to folks that say that is like, if you're using something to like write your outline for you and give you all your ideas, then you didn't write that paper. You maybe contributed to the writing of it, but you didn't write it, And I know that's a hard line stance, I know it is. But I also have to then bring the goods with my students and be like, all right, so we're gonna practice writing, we're gonna, start from scratch. And because I do think, and this is what scares me, is that these companies are getting people addicted to it such that we will see even more of a decrease in skills about writing, as like AI in third grade and second grade and first grade and all these horrible things. Like they're gonna be addicted. It's like giving kids cigarettes, and yeah, so I know that's doom and gloom, I'm sorry. But I also don't want to tell another professor what to do. But I think they're a loser. So I wrote this article called AI is for Losers, and like I do think that if you have a PhD in something and you're using a machine to write something, you're a loser.
On that note.